Here's some sound, and we'll talk.
Those exclusive new details about Bill Cosby's sex assault mistrial. A juror speaking only to ABC, taking us inside those 52 hours of deliberation. This is a stunning account, and revealing why the 12 jurors were ultimately unable to come to an agreement. ABC's Lindsay Davis has the story.
From crying outbursts to intense arguments to a possible hand injury after one juror punched a wall, the 52 hours of deliberations inside a tiny room not large enough to even pace took a toll on the jurors in Bill Cosby's sexual assault trial, according to a juror in an exclusive interview with ABC News who describes the experience as grueling and emotional. The juror, who agreed to speak to us on the condition of anonymity, said 2 jurors prevented a guilty verdict. 10 of the 12 jurors agreed Cosby was guilty of 2 of the 3 counts against him, having a sexual encounter with accuser Andrea Constan without her consent, and giving Constan drugs without her knowledge to prevent her from resisting. But the juror also told us they were near acquittal on one count, that Constan was unconscious during the event. The vote, 11-1. When they first entered the room and took a non-binding preliminary poll, the jurors overwhelmingly said they thought Cosby was not guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. The juror says the holdouts against finding the 79-year-old entertainer guilty were not moving no matter what. Constan says Cosby drugged and sexually assaulted her at his home in 2004. He says the encounter was consensual. Although only one other accuser was allowed to testify at trial, more than 50 other women have come forward with similar accusations. Cosby has also denied those allegations. ABC News reached out to several other jurors who declined to comment. But the juror we spoke to tells us despite the fiery exchanges and intense pressure, the group of 7 men and 5 women are now friendly and keeping in touch by phone and text. Lindsay Davis, ABC News, New York.
And this is really fascinating. Let's bring in ABC's chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams. Dan, always great to have you on this. But this notion that the jurors would enter that room, a non-binding vote, all of them saying not guilty, and then over the course of 6 days, 10 out of the 12 would decide guilty on 2 counts.
Yeah, look, it's very typical for jurors to take a straw vote when they come in and say, where does everyone stand? And everyone sort of raises their hands. That's part of the deliberation process, right? That's not a binding verdict. That's not a ruling. That doesn't happen until the verdict form goes in. But what's astonishing here is that you had all of them saying not guilty, and then as the deliberation process went on, 10-2. I mean, this is out of a movie. Right, this is like 12 Angry Men the other way. It's I've never heard of something like this, where 10 of the 12 jurors apparently changed their minds to the point from where they were ready to acquit, prepared to convict by the end.
Lindsay was reporting there. It was a tiny room, not even room to pace, this juror apparently said, but fists into walls. I mean, this could come up again.
Well, I think that you can expect the defense to file a motion and say, look, they were ready to acquit. If the room hadn't been so terrible and the situation hadn't been so bad, Bill Cosby would have been acquitted, and therefore there should be no retrial. They're not going to win on that motion. They'll likely make it, but that's not the sort of motion you win on. To win on something like that, you have to really show juror misconduct. And even when you show juror misconduct, typically what you get is a new trial. And Bill Cosby's getting a new trial anyway. So really interesting, though, this reporting on this.
A peek inside that juror room. All right, Dan Abrams, always great to have you here. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, Tom, you've been covering this from the get-go. What is your take of the hung jury, if you will?
Well, I'm not surprised. I always thought it was a weak case. I wasn't in the courtroom. I don't know the evidence like people who participated know it. But it was always my understanding that the accuser had not been credible with the police when she initially talked to them, that she apparently said she hadn't had contact with them after the alleged event. Covered, I think, that there was something like 72 phone calls between them, and that she and her mother had gone to a concert either with them or he got them tickets. And that was very suspicious to me. And there's no forensic evidence tying Cosby to anything. And my understanding is that deposition that they read, that the prosecution thought would be good for them, Cosby says everything was consensual. He says everything was consensual, I think. So that sounds like a tough case to me. That's a he said, she said type case. And I don't know why it would get stronger the next time around, but then you never know who's going to be on the jury. And who's going to control the jury room, dominate it, who's going to want to go home. You just don't know. And by the way, there's a show that's going to be on Oxygen next month, July, where they're going to focus on the Michael Jackson jury. I was interviewed for the show. I'm on that show. Well, I was interviewed for it. Exactly who they'll put in it and how they'll do it, I don't know. But my understanding is they got 6 jurors to participate in the show. So I'm going to certainly be looking at that one.
It's interesting with these jurors, and we had the 2 jurors in the Michael Jackson case change their mind after they got involved with Stacey Brown allegedly. So we see that a lot.
Well, but that's all meaningless because, you know, when you're on a jury, you're told not to watch media, not to read anything about the case, not to discuss the case with anyone outside the jury room. And then, you know, as you said, I think it was a couple of months later after they were saturated with media and who knows who they knew that talked to them and were upset with it. And all of a sudden they say they've changed their mind. That's meaningless to me.
Yeah. Once they put in their final vote, there should be some kind of law, I guess, that prevents them from saying, you know what, now I think he's guilty. I mean, it's kind of like it's wrong, you know, morally, and it should be wrong lawfully.
Well, I think both of the jurors you're talking about initially were interviewed right after the verdict, and were defending their verdict. And then for 2 months later to say maybe I made a mistake. You know, to come out 2 months later and say I made a mistake, I don't put much importance in that. I really don't.
Now, you were interviewed along with John Burris and Wendy Murphy, and you predicted that it's going to be a weak case and Bill Cosby will walk this next trial.
Well, I think it's a very weak case, but you never know who's going to be on the jury and what perspective or bias they'll bring in. You just don't know, and that's why jury trials are risky. They're very hard to predict. But I don't think it's a strong case, and I think we learned that, you know, when the jury hung.
Now, I look at your case where they tried to bring in at least 5 accusers to show the same pattern. Now, this judge could have brought in, I guess, all 50-plus accusers because that's what there was. They found, I guess, 5. You know, what goes into that situation? Is it Pennsylvania? Is it versus California? Is it the judge? How does that work?
It's very discretionary with the judge. In the Jackson case, the prosecution wanted to bring in more evidence than he let them bring in, but he let them bring in evidence that 5 other young men had been molested. And he allowed them to bring in witnesses to say they saw that, even if the prosecution didn't bring the actual so-called victim in. So, you know, they brought in evidence and witnesses to say that Macaulay Culkin and Wade Robson and Brett Barnes were molested. And then I started our case by bringing in those 3 who said they weren't molested. Now, in the Cosby case, the prosecution wanted to bring in 13 other witnesses claiming that, you know, they wanted to show that Bill Cosby had a pattern of doing this to women. And the judge let them only bring 1 in. So they got a bigger break than we got in the Michael Jackson case, that's for sure. And remember, their trial was 6 days. Ours was 5 months.
That's a huge difference. And now, are you familiar with Bill Cosby's lawyer? And if so, what did you think of his job?
Well, I don't know them, but I think they did an excellent job. I mean, the result shows they did. You know, they have very good reputations. There's a fellow in Pennsylvania who's got a very good reputation, former prosecutor. I understand his closing argument was excellent. And there's a female lawyer from Los Angeles who I think is handling all of his civil cases. And for what I can see, she's doing an excellent job. So the legal team is to be commended. They did a great job for their client.
What about the wife basically going off on the prosecutor, the judge, and everything? A lot of legal analysts said maybe she should have not did that, knowing that there's another trial coming up and you might be dealing with the same judge. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, I mean, it's understandable why she's upset and emotional. And I think the judge is enough of a professional to not take that into account when there's a retrial. And I think everyone understands how upset Mrs. Cosby must be over this terrible thing. Remember, he's facing a bunch of civil cases. His reputation's been hurt. He may have to sit in a criminal courtroom again. So I think everybody understands why she's upset. I don't think
and
it'll
he
affect
was
the judge.
supposedly joking with the fans when they, I guess he did some kind of Fat Albert skit, and he said, hey. I guess he was in a good mood. He never, seemed down. Was that good? Is that good for your client to do something like that? Like, hey.
Jordan, I wasn't there. I don't know all the details, so I can't pass judgment on him. I'm not in his shoes, and I wasn't there, and I don't know exactly what happened. But, my understanding is he tried to keep his spirits up. I think he showed respect for everybody in the courtroom, which he should have. So I'm not about to criticize anybody when I really don't know what I'm talking about.